Julian Kang placed the folder on the gleaming obsidian table. The sound was a soft, final thud in the cavernous boardroom, a room that had witnessed the silent, brutal consolidation of his family's empire for 3 generations. It was a sound of punctuation, an end, or perhaps a beginning. His grandmother, Chairwoman Kang, sat at the head of the table, a tiny, formidable woman encased in gray silk and centuries of tradition. Her face, a mask of aristocratic displeasure, was turned toward the panoramic window overlooking the city, but her attention was a physical weight on Julian. "I have heard whispers," she began, her voice thin but sharp, like the edge of a shard of glass. "Whispers about this librarian, this little charity case you have been embarrassing the family name with." Julian said nothing. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he had learned from her. Let the opponent fill the void with their own anxieties. She finally turned her gaze on him. Her eyes were black, chips of the same obsidian as the table between them. "They say you are serious, that you entertain notions of a future with this nobody." "Her name is Alara," Julian said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that did nothing to conceal the steel beneath it. A dismissive, ugly sound escaped her lips, not quite a laugh. "The name of a stray. It does not matter. What matters is duty. What matters is legacy. What matters is an heir to carry the Kang name forward." Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. "And she can't give you an heir." The words hung in the air, a deliberate, cruel blow meant to cripple him. He had expected it. He had prepared for it. "She already has," he replied, his voice unnervingly calm. He slid the folder across the polished surface. It glided silently, coming to a stop directly in front of her. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. Her perfectly manicured hand, adorned with a jade ring worth more than the building Alara worked in, trembled slightly as she reached for it. She opened it. Inside, the first page was a laboratory report, a long string of genetic markers, columns of data, and at the very bottom, a conclusion highlighted in a stark, unavoidable yellow. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. 6 months earlier, the world had been a monochrome palette of responsibility and violence. Julian walked through it, a ghost in a tailored suit, his existence a series of obligations he never chose. Power was a cage, wealth a burden, and loneliness a constant companion. He was on his way to a meeting, a sterile discussion of shipping routes and unfriendly takeovers, when his driver was forced to detour through a quiet, forgotten neighborhood of the city, a place of old brick and struggling storefronts. And then he saw her. Through the large, slightly grimy window of a public library, a building that seemed to be sagging under the weight of its own proud history, was a flash of color in his gray world. A woman with hair the color of warm chestnuts was laughing, her head thrown back, a book held loosely in one hand. The sunlight, filtered through the dusty glass, caught the curve of her throat, the genuine, uninhibited joy on her face. It was Alara. The world didn't just slow down, it stopped. The city noise, the hum of the engine, the voice of his lieutenant, Minjun, beside him. It all faded into a dull, distant roar. All that existed was her. A feeling, sharp and profound, struck him like a physical blow to the chest. It wasn't lust, it was recognition. A deep, primal part of his soul uncoiled and said, "There." "Sir?" Minjun's voice broke through the spell. "Julian? We're going to be late." Julian didn't look away from the window. "Cancel the meeting." "Cancel, sir. This is the final negotiation with the Takeda Group." "Reschedule it," Julian commanded, his eyes still fixed on the woman who was now animatedly talking to a small child, her hands shaping a story in the air. "I don't care. Find out everything about her." Minjun followed his gaze and saw a woman in a worn cardigan. He saw nothing remarkable, but he knew that look on his friend's face. It was the same look Julian got before closing a deal that would ruin a competitor for a generation. It was a look of absolute, unshakable focus. The pursuit was a masterclass in how a man with infinite resources could be a complete and utter fool. The file Minjun produced was thin. Ilara Vance, 26, a librarian at the Northwood branch, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate. Parents deceased, save for a mother in a small town upstate. Her only notable debt was a mountain of medical bills from her father's long illness. She was, in the language of his world, a non-entity. To Julian, the sparse details only made her more real. His first move was a tactical error of catastrophic proportions. He had his foundation wire an anonymous donation of $2 million to the library. The next day, the money was returned. Attached was a crisp, formal letter stating the library board could not accept funds from an unverified source. He could feel her principled defiance in the very ink. He went to the library himself. He walked in wearing a suit that cost more than her annual salary, the scent of his expensive cologne an invasive presence in the quiet sanctuary of books and dust motes. She was at the main desk, her brow furrowed in concentration as she repaired the spine of an old book with delicate, patient hands. He approached. "Excuse me." She looked up, and her eyes, a startling shade of green mixed with gold, widened almost imperceptibly. He felt that punch to the chest all over again. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. "I'm the one who made the donation," he said, deciding directness was the only path. A flash of something, annoyance, maybe even anger, crossed her face before being replaced by a professional mask. "Ah, well, as the letter stated, we have procedures." "The procedures are irrelevant. The library needs the money. The roof is leaking over the children's section." He'd noticed it on his way in. Her chin lifted. "We are aware of our maintenance issues. We're a public institution. We have protocols for fundraising. We are not a convenient place to launder money." The accusation was so blunt, so utterly fearless, it took him by surprise. No one spoke to him that way. No one dared. He found himself inexplicably charmed. "It isn't laundered," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Then I'm sure you won't mind going through the proper channels," she retorted, turning her attention pointedly back to the book in her hands. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Dismissed. Julian Kang had been dismissed by a librarian in a faded cardigan. He left the library that day feeling more alive than he had in a decade. His next attempts were just as clumsy. A torrent of flowers arrived at her apartment, arrangements so large they barely fit through the door. They were sent back. A vintage, first-edition copy of her favorite novel, sourced from a collector in Paris, was delivered by courier. It was returned the next day with a note scrawled on a napkin. "This belongs in a museum, not my living room." Her roommate Chloe was beside herself. "Alara, are you clinically insane?" she demanded, holding a cashmere scarf he'd sent, the fabric like a cloud in her hands. "This is probably from that handsome, terrifying man from the library. People don't just reject gifts like this. It's not normal." "It's not normal for a complete stranger to try and buy my attention," Alara shot back, her jaw tight. "It's creepy, and I don't want anything from him. There's something dangerous about him." She was right, of course. She had no idea how right she was. Her instincts were saving her, and Julian found himself in the frustrating position of admiring the very defenses he was trying to breach. He finally realized his power, his wealth, were not assets here. They were liabilities. He had to strip himself of his armor. He went back to the library, this time dressed in simple trousers and a plain black sweater. He didn't approach her desk. He just found a quiet corner, picked up a random book, and pretended to read. He did this for 3 days straight. On the third day, as she was closing up, she walked over to his table. Are you going to actually check out a book, or is this part of some new silent stalking strategy? She asked, her arms crossed. The sarcasm was thick, but there was a sliver of curiosity in her eyes. I was waiting to talk to you, he said honestly. We're closed. Then let me walk you home. She stared at him, a long, appraising look. He held her gaze, trying to convey nothing but sincerity, a foreign emotion for him. He felt stripped bare, more vulnerable than he'd ever been in a boardroom full of sharks. Fine, she said, sighing as if conceding a great defeat. But if you try to offer me a diamond or a controlling interest in a Fortune 500 company, I'm macing you. That walk was the beginning. He didn't offer her anything but his attention. He asked her about the books she loved, about her dream of one day owning a small, curated bookstore where people could find stories that mattered. He listened. He learned that her father had been a history professor who taught her to love the weight of a book in her hands, and that her mother worried constantly about her scraping by in the city. In return, she asked him questions he hadn't considered in years. What did he like to do? What made him happy? He had no real answers. His life was work. His happiness was a foreign concept. You're a very lonely man, aren't you? She said softly, not as an accusation, but as a simple, empathetic observation. The words hit him harder than any physical threat. Yes, he admitted, the truth raw in his throat. He asked her on a proper date, not to a Michelin star restaurant that he owned, but to a small coffee shop she liked. He arrived early, dressed down again, and felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager. When she walked in, a simple green dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, his breath caught. She was so uniquely captivating, her beauty rooted in an authenticity his world completely lacked. They talked for hours. He found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone, not even Minjun. He spoke of the suffocating pressure of his family name, the feeling of being a figurehead in a life he didn't design. He didn't tell her the truth, not the whole truth, but he gave her the shape of it. The darkness, the isolation. She didn't flinch. She listened, her green-gold eyes filled with a compassion that felt like a balm on a wound he didn't even know he had. She made him feel seen, not as the head of the Kang Syndicate, but as Julian, just Julian. At the end of the night, he walked her to the door of her apartment building. The air was charged, the space between them humming with unspoken energy. I had a good time, she said, her voice barely a whisper, which is incredibly annoying. He couldn't help the small smile that formed on his lips. I'm glad I could be an annoyance. He didn't plan to kiss her. He had sworn to himself he would be patient, that he would earn her trust piece by piece. But she looked up at him, her lips slightly parted, her wariness for once completely gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that mirrored his own. He leaned in, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. It was a hesitant question. She gave him his answer by leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. The kiss was everything. It was not the kiss of a kingpin taking what he wanted. It was the kiss of a drowning man finding air. It was tentative at first, then deepened with a desperate, aching need that came from a place of profound loneliness. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, and he could feel the frantic beat of her heart. Or maybe it was his own. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. This is a bad idea, she whispered, though she made no move to pull away. I know, he murmured, resting his forehead against hers. The best ones always are. Their worlds began to bleed into one another. He took her to a lavish charity gala, an event crawling with the city's elite. He watched, fascinated, as she navigated the treacherous waters of wealth and power with an unassuming grace. She wore a simple, elegant black dress he'd had delivered, after asking her permission this time. and she looked more radiant than any of the women dripping in jewels. When a condescending politician's wife asked her what she did, Alara simply smiled and said, "I help people find stories." A response so pure it disarmed the woman completely. She, in turn, dragged him into her life. They ate cheap pizza on the floor of her apartment with Chloe, who had finally decided Julian was terrifyingly charming and worthy of her friend. He found himself laughing, a real, genuine laugh, for the first time in memory. He helped Alara shelve books during a late-night shift at the library, the simple, manual labor a strange and welcome respite from his life of high-stakes decisions. In these quiet moments, the walls around his heart, built over a lifetime of duty and darkness, began to crumble. He was falling in love with her, deeply, irrevocably, and it terrified him. Because he was living a lie, a beautiful, fragile lie that was destined to shatter. The first crack appeared in the form of his grandmother. Minjun brought him the news, his face grim. "The chairwoman is asking questions, Julian. She's had a private investigator looking into Alara, her finances, her family, everything." Ice flooded Julian's veins. "She knows." "She knows you're serious," Minjun corrected. "And she sees Alara as a threat to the line, to tradition." Julian knew what that meant. In his grandmother's world, threats were not tolerated. They were eliminated. He couldn't protect Alara if she didn't know what she needed protection from. The lie had to end. He took her to his penthouse. It was a place he rarely used, a sterile fortress of glass and steel perched high above the city, a monument to his isolation. It was the heart of his gilded cage. She looked around, her eyes wide. The sheer scale of the wealth on display was oppressive. "Wow," she said softly. "This is a lot." "It's not my home," he said quickly. "My home is wherever you are." The words were true, but they felt hollow, a prelude to the storm he was about to unleash. He poured them both a drink, his hands unsteady. He led her to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the sprawling metropolis below. "I need to tell you the truth, Alara," he began, his voice strained. "The whole truth." She turned to him, her expression soft, encouraging. "Julian, you can tell me anything." And so he did. He told her everything. He laid the ugliness of his life bare. The Kang Syndicate wasn't just a vaguely shady import-export business. He used the words he had always avoided: extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, violence. He told her about his father, who had groomed him since birth to take over, to be colder, more ruthless than he was. He told her about the scar that traced a thin white line above his eyebrow, a gift from a rival family when he was just 19. He told her this penthouse, this city, this life was his prison. "I have done things," he confessed, his voice cracking, the shame of physical weight. "Things I can never undo. I am not a good man, Alara." He watched her face as he spoke, watched the beautiful light in her eyes dim. The compassion was replaced by confusion, then dawning horror, and finally, a profound and terrible sadness. The silence that followed his confession was worse than any shouting match. It was the sound of her heart breaking. It was the sound of his world ending. She started, her voice a fragile whisper. She took a step back, as if his proximity could physically harm her. "The people you hurt people." "It's a world I inherited," he said, the words a pathetic excuse even to his own ears. "I'm trying to change it. For you, I can—" "No!" she interrupted, shaking her head, tears now streaming freely down her pale cheeks. "You don't understand. It's not about changing for me. It's about what you are. The money you spent on me, the gifts. Where did it come from? Whose suffering paid for it?" The question was a knife in his gut. He had no answer that would comfort her. I can't, she sobbed, backing away toward the door. I can't be with you, Julian. I love you. God, I love you so much it hurts. But I can't be a part of that world. It would destroy everything I am. It would break me. He moved toward her, his hand outstretched, a desperate plea. Alara, please, don't go. We can figure this out. I can leave it all behind. Can you? She asked, her voice filled with a devastating clarity. Can you really walk away from centuries of that? From your own family? They wouldn't let you. She was right. He knew she was right, but he would have burned the world down for her. I love you, he said, his voice raw with desperation. I know, she whispered, her hand on the doorknob. She gave him one last, heartbroken look. And that's the tragedy. Goodbye, Julian. Then she was gone. The door closed with a soft click that echoed through the vast, empty penthouse like a gunshot. He stood there, frozen, as the magnificent city lights blurred into a meaningless smear of color through his tears. He had never felt so utterly alone. The world went back to gray. No, it was worse. It was a complete absence of color, a void. Julian fell back into his role as the cold, ruthless leader of the Kang Syndicate. But it was a hollow performance. The fire in him was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness. He moved through his days like a machine, his decisions precise and brutal, his face an unreadable mask. But at night, alone in his sterile apartment, the facade crumbled. He would stare at the ceiling for hours, the ghost of her laughter echoing in the silence, the memory of her touch a phantom ache on his skin. Minjun watched his friend wither. This is not sustainable, Julian, he said one evening, finding him staring into a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. You are destroying yourself. She's gone, Julian stated, the words flat and dead. It's over. Then make it not over. You are Julian Kang. You don't just accept defeat. She chose to leave. It was her choice, he ground out. What could he do? Force her to be with him? Chain her to his dark world? The thought was repugnant. He loved her, which meant her freedom, her principles, had to matter more than his own selfish desires. He did the only thing he could think of. He had her watched. A discreet security team, so far removed she would never know, tasked with one simple objective: keep her safe. It was a violation of her trust, a creepy, possessive act he knew she would despise. But the thought of her being vulnerable and alone in the world was a torment he could not bear. Meanwhile, Alara had fled. She'd packed a single bag, quit her job with a vague explanation, and taken a bus to her mother's small, quiet town upstate. She told Chloe she just needed a break, a lie that didn't fool her friend for a second. She spent her days in a state of suspended animation, helping her mother in the garden, taking long, aimless walks through the woods. But there was no escaping him. Every handsome stranger made her heart leap in terror and hope. Every black car that passed on the street sent a jolt of panic through her. She had escaped his world, but she was haunted by the man she had left at its center. She missed his quiet intensity, the surprising gentleness in his hands, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the universe. She had chosen her principles over her heart, and the price was a loneliness as profound and vast as his own. A month after she left, the nausea started, then the fatigue. She chalked it up to stress and heartbreak until her mother, with a knowing, worried look, pushed a pregnancy test into her hand. Alara stared at the 2 pink lines, and her world tilted on its axis once more. A baby, Julian's baby. A wave of terror washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. A child would tie her to him, to his world, forever. It would be a target. His family, his grandmother. The thought of what they might do was paralyzing. But then, another feeling rose up, fierce and powerful, drowning out the fear. It was love, a primal, protective love for the tiny life growing inside her. This was her child, hers. She would protect it. She would raise this baby far from the shadow of the Kang name, in peace and safety. She would do it alone. The decision settled in her heart with the weight of stone, but also with a core of unshakable resolve. Julian was in a meeting, staring blankly at financial projections, when Minjun entered and placed a single thin file on the table in front of him. It contained a photo. It was Alara, walking out of a small-town clinic, her hand resting instinctively on her still, flat stomach. The report was brief: multiple visits to an obstetrician, confirmed pregnancy, estimated at 6 weeks. The air left Julian's lungs. A child. His child. A dizzying mix of emotions crashed over him: terror for her safety, rage at his own powerlessness to be with her, and a surge of fierce protective joy so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He had thought his heart was broken beyond repair, but this news stitched it back together with threads of pure steel. This changed everything. His misery didn't matter anymore. His loneliness was a luxury he could no longer afford. Promises were not enough. Apologies were meaningless. He had to act. He had to tear his world down and rebuild it into something worthy of her, something safe for their child. "Cancel my schedule for the next month," he told Minjun, his voice filled with a purpose that had been missing for so long. "And assemble the board, all of them, including my grandmother." The meeting was a declaration of war. The old guard, men whose loyalty was to his father's violent legacy, sat with his grandmother, the embodiment of that tradition. Julian stood before them, not as an heir, but as a revolutionary. "The Kang Syndicate is changing," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Effective immediately, we are divesting from all illicit enterprises, the casinos, the lending operations, the networks of intimidation. They will be sold off or dismantled. We will absorb the financial losses and refocus our entire operation on our legitimate holdings: global logistics, technology, real estate. We are going to be a clean corporation." The room erupted. Shouts of protest, accusations of betrayal. His grandmother's face was a mask of cold fury. "You would throw away a century of our family's power?" an old uncle snarled. "For what?" "For a future," Julian answered, his gaze sweeping over them, daring any of them to challenge him. "You do this for that girl?" his grandmother stated, her voice a low hiss. "That gutter snipe has poisoned your mind." "I do this for me," Julian lied, the words tasting like ash. He couldn't tell them about the baby. It would paint an even larger target on Alara's back. "I will not live in the past. This is the new way. You will either get on board, or you will be left behind." It was in the chaotic aftermath of this edict, as he fought to untangle the criminal empire his ancestors had built, that his grandmother made her move. His surveillance team reported that she had discovered the pregnancy. He didn't know how. Her own spies were as insidious as his, but he knew what it meant. The threat was no longer abstract. He called her to the main boardroom, the stage for their final confrontation. He was ready this time. He'd had Minjun discreetly obtain a DNA sample, a stray hair from a brush Alara had left at his apartment, and had it tested against his own. He needed irrefutable proof. He needed a weapon. And so he stood there, watching her approach the obsidian table, her face a storm of righteous anger. "I have heard whispers," she began, the words dripping with contempt. "Whispers about this librarian." He let her speak, let her pour all her venom into the sterile air. He let her talk about duty and legacy and heirs. He waited for the killing blow he knew was coming. "She can't give you an heir." He felt a cold calm settle over him. He had won. She didn't know he already knew. She thought she was holding the ultimate trump card. She already has, he said, sliding the folder across the table. He watched her face crumble as she read the report. He saw the flicker of uncertainty, the tremor in her hand. He saw the realization that she had lost. But he wasn't finished. "You came here today to tell me you knew she was pregnant," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You were going to call the child a bastard. You were going to threaten her. You were going to have her dealt with to protect the family name." The color drained from her face. "Let me be clear," Julian continued, leaning forward, his hands flat on the table. "She is the mother of my son, or my daughter, and you will not touch her. You will not speak her name. This family is changing, as I said. I am its future. That child is its future, and there is no place in it for you." He had effectively exiled his own grandmother. He had severed the final tie to his dark past. The cost was immense, but for the first time in his life, he felt free. He drove for 3 hours, the city shrinking in his rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and open sky. He found her in the small town's only park. She was sitting on a bench, a book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She was just staring at the trees, her face pale and drawn, and she was visibly pregnant, a gentle curve to her belly that sent another shock of love and terror through him. She saw him approaching, and her entire body went rigid with fear. She stood up, her hand flying protectively to her stomach. He stopped a dozen feet away, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. He didn't dare get closer, didn't dare spook her. He just stood there, letting her see him. He knew what he must look like, a man who hadn't slept in weeks, his suit rumpled, his eyes haunted, but filled with a desperate, pleading hope. "Alara," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "How did you find me?" "I had to," he said simply. He took a deep breath. He had to lay the truth at her feet, with no demands, no expectations. "I know about the baby." A choked sob escaped her. "Julian, please, just leave us alone. We'll be fine. You don't have to—" "I'm not here to take you back," he interrupted gently. "I'm here to tell you what I've done." And he told her everything. He told her about the meeting, about the selling of the illicit divisions, the war he had declared on his own family. He told her about the confrontation with his grandmother. "It's not clean yet," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "There are years of rot to cut out, but I'm doing it. I'm building a legitimate company, something real, something that doesn't hurt people." He finally looked her straight in the eye, his soul bare. "I'm making it safe, Ilada. For you. For our child." She stared at him, her eyes wide, searching his face for any sign of deception. She saw only exhaustion, sincerity, and a love so profound it was staggering. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart, the walls of principle and fear, began to dissolve. The love she had tried so hard to bury rushed back, fierce and overwhelming. "You did all that?" she whispered, taking a hesitant step toward him. He nodded, a single desperate motion. "For you. It was only ever for you." She closed the remaining distance between them. Her hand came up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He was real. This was real. "You idiot," she breathed, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "You absolute reckless idiot." "I know," he whispered, his own tears finally falling. And then she was in his arms, and his mouth was on hers. It was not a kiss of seduction or triumph. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was desperate and messy, full of all the pain of their separation and all the hope of a future they might finally be able to build together. He held her like she was the only anchor in his world, his hand gently cradling the back of her head, the other resting protectively over the slight swell of her stomach, over their child, their future. It was uncertain, it would be difficult, but it would be theirs. And for the first time, standing in a small town park far from the shadows of his past, Julian Kang felt like he was finally home. This story is a testament to the transformative power of love and the idea that no one is beyond redemption. It shows that true strength isn't found in power or control, but in the vulnerability and courage required to change for the better. Julian's journey from a man trapped by a dark legacy to one willing to dismantle his entire world for the sake of love and family illustrates that our past does not have to define our future. Ilara's unwavering principles, even in the face of immense temptation and heartbreak, remind us that integrity is a treasure worth protecting. Ultimately, their story suggests that the most profound legacies are not built on wealth or power, but on the foundations of love, safety, and the hope for a better tomorrow. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. The characters face complex choices that test their beliefs, and their journey highlights the difficult but rewarding path of choosing love and morality over duty and darkness. If you are moved by Julian and Ilara's story, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel for more dramatic romances, and sharing this video with someone who loves a story about redemption. Now we have a question for you. When Ilara discovered she was pregnant, she chose to hide it and raise the child alone. Do you think this was a brave act of protection, or should she have told Julian the truth right away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And finally, we want to know what you want to see next. Which story sounds most interesting for our next video? A. The story of Minjun, the loyal lieutenant, who falls for a brilliant corporate lawyer hired to help legitimize the Kang Empire. B. The story of Chloe, Ilara's best friend, who gets swept up in a whirlwind romance with a rival of the Kang family, not knowing the danger she's in. Choose A or B in the comments, and we'll write the winning story. Thank you for watching.